Cool. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on how to master user interviews from the UX Design Institute and in collaboration with Hotjar. My name is Rachel. I'm the Head of Research and Insights at the UX Design Institute, and I'll be one of your hosts for today's webinar. I'll tell you a little bit about myself before I introduce my co-host. So my background is in psychology, and I have been working in research for the past 10 years or so. And I've worked across lots of different research areas, but my particular interest is in human behavior and how people interact with digital interfaces. So that's me. I'll hand you over to Sarah, my co-host, to introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for making it to our webinar today. My name is Sarah. I am originally from the US, but I am based in Rome, Italy, and I trained as an anthropologist. So I moved from academia to industry, and now I am a senior product researcher at Hotjar. For those of you who haven't heard of us, we are a product analytics, digital experience analytics tool, helping people understand what their users do when they come to their website or their digital products to help create better user experiences on the web.
Cool. Great. Thanks, Sarah. We'll share our LinkedIn profiles in the chat now. If anybody would like to connect with us, please feel free to do that. So before we get started, I just want to explain a little bit about how you can interact with us during the webinar. We're hoping that this will be a really interactive session. So if you have any questions or ideas you'd like to share, please feel free to do that. You'll see on screen that you have both a chat box and a questions box. The chat box can be used for kind of general conversation. If there's any comments you'd like to make, please feel free to do that in there. But if you have a specific question for either myself or for Sarah, please make sure to use the questions box. This just makes it easier for us to see the questions as they come through. The chat can get a little bit busy. And we'll make sure to leave some time for Q&A at the end of the presentation, and we'll do our best to answer as many questions that are in the questions box as we can. Within the questions box itself, then you'll be able to upvote other people's questions using the small arrow icon you can see on screen now. So if someone asks a question that you'd also like to hear the answer to, just make sure to give it a vote, and that will just let myself and Sarah know if there are any burning questions out there, and we'll make sure to answer those ones first. Okay, so to kick off, if you haven't already done so, we'd love if you could introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know where you're joining from, maybe what you do for work. Are you a UX designer, a user researcher, or something else? Let us know there in the chat. Cool, seeing lots of responses there and lots of different places. It's great to see how many different places people are joining from. Egypt, Argentina, Berlin. Amazing. Okay, great. Okay, while you guys are introducing yourself, I will continue on. And just talk a little bit for a second. I want to talk about the latest course from the UX Design Institute. So I'm actually one of the course contributors and mentors on this course. So if you enjoy the webinar tonight, I'd really recommend you check out the course. This course is aimed at anybody who's interested in starting a career in user research, as well as those who are already maybe working in the area but want to brush up their skills or even just to gain a recognized qualification. The course itself has a really comprehensive curriculum. It covers the full range of qualitative and quantitative user research methods. It takes around 4 months to complete if you spend roughly 3 hours per week on study. So it's really ideal for people who are working full-time. The content is delivered through on-demand video lessons, so you can study whenever really and wherever you want. But we also want this to be a really interactive experience. So there is live support from course tutors, as well as live webinars like this one, and ones as well with your mentors who are seasoned professionals in user research and who are working in the industry. So at the moment, there is an early bird offer available on the course that will save you €200. But we're also going to offer an additional €100 off for anybody who's attending this webinar. And that discount will be on offer until the 14th of February. And these discounts, both the early bird and the webinar discount, are available in all countries and currencies. We're going to share some links in the chat now so that you can take a look at the course in more detail in your own time after the webinar, and for you to be able to take advantage of the webinar discount while it's on. So I just want to cover just a couple of key features of the course, and then we'll jump into the content of the webinar. So one of the key features of all UX Design Institute courses is that they are university credit rated. So this means you're guaranteed a university standard education. As I've already mentioned, the course covers the full range of qualitative and quantitative user research methods. So you'll learn how to conduct user interviews, usability tests, surveys, A/B tests, analytics, and more. You'll learn how to analyze your data and present your insights, and you'll also complete a series of projects that you can include in your research portfolio. And finally, then, we all are aware of how big a development AI is in the industry at the moment. So we've made sure to include a module on how you can use AI in your research process. Okay, so we're going to kick off with the content of the webinar now, but before we do, I'd just love to know what you're hoping to learn. So feel free to post in the chat. Tell me a little bit about what you're here for, what you're most hoping to find out about. Cool. We'll have a quick look in here. Cool. I can see lots of people typing away there. So I'm going to let you guys type away. We'll have some people reply to you in the chat, and I'll keep moving on as you're doing that. Okay, so what we're going to cover today. First, we're going to have a quick reminder of why user research is so important. I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, since you all are obviously interested in user research, but we might as well start off there. And then we're going to cover what exactly user interviews are, and we'll discuss when is best to use user interviews as an approach. Next, then, we're going to talk a little bit about how to define your research questions and goals. And after that, we'll talk about how to use your research questions and goals to develop your interview script. Then I'm going to hand over to Sarah, who will present for the remainder of the presentation. And Sarah's going to talk about how to recruit the right participants for your research, which is a really key element that we want to get right. And she'll also share some top moderating tips to help you conduct effective user interviews. Finally, then, Sarah will talk us through Hotjar Engage and how you can use that to automate your interview process. And then we'll finish up, as I've mentioned, with a couple of minutes for Q&A. So do make sure to post your questions in the questions panel to upvote other people's questions. But bear with us, we won't be looking at questions until the end, but we will definitely leave time for that. Okay, so lots to get through. So I'm going to get started, and we're going to start right at the beginning with a fun reminder of why user research is so important. So what you're seeing on screen here is a little wooden bench that holds 3 cat bowls. This might be something you've seen on social media before, so it's just a bit of fun and a nice way to remind people of why we need to do user research. So underneath the image there, I've included a quote, and anyone who works in research, you may have heard something like this before from stakeholders or people you work with. And the quote reads, "We don't need research. Our product is intuitive. Users will definitely know what to do." But the thing is, and it's probably one of the things I love most about working in research, is that people are unpredictable. They really rarely behave the way we expect them to. And this is what you can see here. So here's just an example of the unpredictability and how, really why we always need research to understand what it is people will do when they are actually given your product. So what we need to remember here is that you are not the target audience for your product. So your colleagues, you're not the end user. So whatever might be intuitive to you may not be so intuitive to others. So in order to really understand our users, essentially we need to speak to them. And that is where research comes in. Okay, so let's have a quick introduction to user interviews. So we'll start off with what are they? So as the name suggests, user interviews are interviews conducted with someone who uses or may want to use your system, product, or service. They're what we'd consider a core qualitative research method, and they're a form of attitudinal research. So that means they're more about what people say, but not necessarily about what people do. So rather than us kind of sitting and observing people's actual behavior with user interviews, we're more interested in talking to people to understand their experiences, their attitudes, and their opinions. User interviews are conducted one-to-one, so that's between the user and the moderator, and they can run for anywhere between 30 minutes to an hour or so. Conveniently, they can be conducted remotely, but they can also be conducted in person. So how are they structured then? They're usually semi-structured, which means the researcher might prepare a set of themes or open questions to guide the discussion. But the order of questions is flexible, and it really depends on the flow of the conversation. So this means that either the interviewer or the participant can introduce new topics or themes, and the conversation can kind of go off in a different direction than you had planned. And this is different to, say, a survey, for example, where once you release a survey, the order of questions is always the same. There's no flexibility. Every participant will be asked every question in the same order. But with user interviews, you have room for flexibility. Okay, and when should you use them? So user interviews are really well suited to any scenario where you need to develop a deep understanding of a topic. So you can use them as a way to explore a person's experiences, their perceptions, their attitudes, and their values. So an example, I often conduct user interviews with people who want to become a UX designer. And when I talk to them, I want to understand their background, where they're coming from, their motivations, so why they want to become a UX designer, any fears or concerns they might have, anything that's holding them back, and maybe their expectations of the career, what they expect it to be like. So user interviews can be useful right at the beginning of a UX project, in the discovery phase. Maybe when you don't know much or maybe even anything about the domain, and you don't yet have a design direction. So at this stage, they can help you answer questions like, who is the target audience? What problems do they want to solve? What their goals are, that kind of thing. I think I just spotted a message there just asking if we can make the slides a little bit bigger. So bear with me for 1 second and I'm going to see if I can make these a little bit bigger for everybody. Okay, let's see. Okay, I think that's as big as we can get them. So hopefully that's a little bit better now. Okay, cool. So another way they can be used, they can really be used, to be honest, at any stage in your design process when you want to understand a topic in depth. So they could be used to help you reframe a design problem, to identify new design opportunities. If you have lots of design ideas, they can help you to narrow those down and refine your concepts. And they can help you to redesign and relaunch products that have already been launched if you want to talk to users about their experiences. Okay, so I just mentioned there that user interviews are a form of attitudinal research. They are essentially about what users say, not what they do. So you're not observing their actual behavior. And I have 2 short stories I want to tell you today. And the first one that I'm going to tell you about is a nice example of, where user interviews are most beneficial, I guess. When they are really well suited to research, and this is just a nice example of that. And the story that I'm going to talk about today, maybe some of you have already heard it, but it's based on the Betty Crocker brand. Now, I will just give a little warning. The story is kind of a product of its time, so you might have to excuse some gender stereotypes in there, but it does still serve as a nice example of research. Okay, so anyway, at this time, when this brand were kind of first launching, it was a time when there were more women than ever in employment, but at this stage, they were still expected to take responsibility for domestic work. And this resulted in a kind of time where women were under more time pressure than ever because they are working, but still responsible for a lot of domestic tasks. And because of this, we saw a phenomenon where there was a big rise in the use of convenience food products. So things like what you can see on screen now, hopefully, which is minute rice. And the idea with this was you could do all the cooking as usual, but then use your minute rice and it will make things easier. So jumping on this convenience trend, the company that was responsible for the Betty Crocker brand released a ginger cake mix, and it promised to take the hassle out of baking with its simple just add water approach. But the thing was, they released the cake mix and it didn't perform as well as expected. And I'd love if anybody has any guesses why this product didn't work as well as expected. If you want to post them in the chat, I'd love to see if there's any guesses. But while you're putting your guesses in there, I'm going to talk about where research played a role. So the company, the Betty Crocker company, they commissioned researchers to carry out interviews with women and try and understand their perceptions of the cake mix. And what they really wanted to explore was what were women's beliefs around baking and what did it mean to them? What did it mean to their identity? And they hoped that might kind of give them some clues as to why this cake mix wasn't working as well as they wanted it to. And what the research revealed was really interesting. So they learned that for these women at this time, baking represented a way for them to show their caring nature. So a lot of their identity and self-worth was associated with providing good, wholesome food for their families. And with the products like the minute rice, they loved that because they were still doing most of the cooking. It was just kind of helping them out, making it a little bit quicker. But with the cake mix, all they had to do was to add water. And for them, it just felt like too little involvement. They actually felt like it was almost a cheat, and they felt like they couldn't produce this cake and say that they had baked it because it was too easy. All they had done was add water. So the researchers went back to the company and they told them this. And based on those insights, the company relaunched the product. And this time they removed the dried eggs that had been in the product. And this time you had to add the eggs yourself. And the idea behind this was to make the baking process feel more involved and feel more like, they had put their love into it and put their caring nature into the job. And as you probably guessed, with that one, sales improved. The cake mix kind of took off then, and it was kind of fitting what these people wanted at the time. So this is just a nice example of where attitudinal research like user interviews worked well. They really helped the researchers understand what was the problem, what was going on, and how the product can better fit. We're going to talk now a little bit about where we want to avoid this kind of research. And this is when we're interested in people's actual behavior. So the first reason for this is because when we're talking to people, their memory can be unreliable. We're not very good at kind of remembering exactly how we behaved in the past. So for example, if I asked everybody that's on the webinar now, what was the first button you clicked on screen when you were signing up for this webinar? You probably wouldn't be able to give me an accurate answer. And if I wanted to answer that question, I'd probably be better off doing a usability test or an A/B test, something like that, and observe what you actually did. And the second reason is that people are really bad at predicting their future behavior. So if I showed you a product now and I asked you, would you pay for this at this price? You might say yes now, but in reality, there's loads of the different things that could come into consideration in reality that would determine whether or not you'd actually pay for the product. So, maybe this month you'd say, yeah, I'd definitely buy that. Maybe next month you'd have more expenses than you thought. And, when it comes down to it, you don't buy the product. So this means if we're interested in people's actual behavior, we can't assume what they tell us in a user interview is entirely accurate. So as I mentioned, we'd be better off in those scenarios to use something like an A/B test or a usability test. Okay, so here's a quick example then, like the last one, but this time it's when they don't work so well. And this time the story centers around Sony. And this story is back in the 1980s when Sony were releasing their boombox. I'm sure a couple of you have heard this story before. It's a little bit of a research legend story, and everybody says it was Sony. I don't know if Sony's ever said it was Sony, but we'll go with Sony. So Sony were in the final stages of development of their boombox, and they decided to carry out a series of focus groups to fine-tune the final product. For anybody who doesn't know, focus groups are like user interviews, but instead of being one-to-one, they're conducted in a group setting. So it would be one moderator and a group of research participants. And one of the focus groups was really focused on color. So what color should the boombox be? And they had narrowed it down to black or white. And in this focus group, the overwhelming consensus was it should be white. They wanted white. They were definite about that. But it just so happened that when the focus group was over, part of the gratuity or incentive for taking part in the focus group was that participants got to take a boombox home. And because they knew that it was either going to be a black or a white boombox, they had a couple of each out in the hall. So participants were allowed to take a boombox home when they left. And again, I'd love to hear your guesses. They've all said in the focus group that they definitely take a white one. But when they left, what do we think? Did they take black or white? I'm going to wait and see. Yeah, black. Okay. Yeah. So that's right. When they left, everybody took a black boombox. And this story is just a bit of fun. And again, it's just a nice reminder. And really what it's about, it's not about saying that people are dishonest. That's not it. It's just that people are bad at predicting their own behavior. And on this next slide then, this is an anthropologist, Margaret Mead, and she summed it up perfectly, I think, with this quote, where she says, what people say, what people do, and what people say they do are three entirely different things. So it's just a nice example to keep that in mind when we are doing user interviews. Okay, so in a minute, I'm going to start to talk a little bit about why people can find moderating user interviews a little bit intimidating. But first, I'd love to know all of your thoughts. We're going to have a poll now in a second, and I'd love to know how confident you are in conducting user interviews. The poll should appear on your screen in a second, and you can vote there. But I'd also really love if you could post in the chat and tell us, what, if anything, makes you nervous? If you are voting that you're not so confident, why is that? What is it about it that makes you nervous? I'm going to have a little bit of a look here in the chat and just see. Okay, a little bit about following the script. Not a great leader of the conversation. Okay, not enough experience in the real world. Never done one before. Okay. This all makes a lot of sense. Okay. Let me just switch over to the poll here and have a look. Okay, cool. All right. So I've actually done my own research on this topic with UX designers to understand a bit about why they find user interviews intimidating. And I think based on some of the things you're posting in the chat, some of you might identify with this. The first thing I heard from UX designers is they don't feel entirely comfortable sitting with users or holding the space. Holding the space is a phrase I've borrowed from the world of psychology or psychotherapy. But what it means in relation to user research is ultimately having the confidence to make the participant feel at ease, to direct the flow of the conversation, and to keep the interview moving at a nice, consistent pace. The next one then is a big one, and this is one I hear of a lot, and it's dreading the awkward silence. So some people just really have a fear that they're not going to know what to say, that there'll be this big silence, they won't be able to keep the participant talking for a full hour or whatever the timing is. But the good news is that actually this awkward silence can be really useful to you, and this is something Sarah's going to talk about a little bit later. Next up, they can just struggle to maintain a natural flow to the conversation. Kind of ties in with that awkward silence. You know, it can be a little bit like stop, start, don't really know how to continue. They can lack the confidence to stray from their script. So I think I saw somebody mention this in the chat. So, you know, if an interesting topic comes up, they can be a little bit nervous to explore that topic because it's not on their script. And, you know, they're afraid that if they deviate from the script, they won't know how to bring it back. And finally, then, some people actually describe themselves as having a really robotic approach and feeling quite rigid, and that it was almost like a Q&A style. And they didn't know how to kind of make it a little bit more natural or make it more conversational. Okay, but I guess the good news for everybody here is that being prepared for your user interviews can really help in terms of helping you manage your nerves. And a lot about what we're going to talk about for the rest of the session is aimed at helping you to be prepared and to manage those nerves. So I'm going to just touch on two short topics, and then I'm going to hand over to Sarah for the rest of the presentation. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is defining your research objectives and questions. So this is the first and most basic building block in being prepared, and it's to set a clear objective. So this really should be your starting point for your research, because it's going to help you to choose what methodology you're going to use, and it's going to help you to keep on track. It's a statement that really should lay out what you want to learn from the research. It should be actionable and to the point. And it should set out the kind of overarching problem that you're kind of trying to solve or what you want to understand. So an example here might be to understand why software engineers want to study UX design. That would be an example of a nice, concise, overarching research objective. After this, then you want to set out your research questions. And these are like the stepping stones you need to cross to get you closer to meeting your research objective. So they're a little bit more specific, and answering each question should bring you closer to achieving your objective. So here's some examples. So it might be, do software engineers want to upskill for their current career, or are they looking to transition into UX? What do they like or dislike about their current career? And what do they imagine a career in UX being like? Just to mention quickly that this process of defining your research objectives, this can be done collaboratively. It's a really nice way of doing this. You could create a Miro board like this one, and it's a really good way to get stakeholders involved in research and invested in research early on. Okay, so once you have your research objectives set and your questions finalized, then you want to start preparing your script. This can also be known as a discussion guide, and essentially it's a list of themes or questions that you want to cover. So going back to the example earlier of the research to understand why software engineers want to study UX design, some questions in your script might be, why have you decided to take a course in UX design? What are some of the things you enjoy about your current job? What frustrations do you have in your current job? What do you imagine a career in UX to be like? It's important to remember, though, that the script is there to guide the interview rather than constrain it. So if a new theme or a new question comes up, that can be explored. It's okay if something comes up that you weren't expecting. And actually, sometimes that's some of the most interesting stuff. But what you should keep in mind is that anything you do explore or spend time exploring should really contribute to your overall objective. You don't want to go off on a total tangent. Even if it is interesting, you want to stay focused on the research at hand. But once it's relevant, it's really good to be able to explore these new topics. This is a kind of a housekeeping thing, but it's important to keep timing in mind, whether that be the 45 minutes, the hour, whatever you plan for. And finally, you want to avoid asking close-ended questions. And I'm going to just really quickly give one or two examples of close-ended questions here. So these are questions really that prompt the participant to give a one-worded answer or a yes/no response, something like that. So here's an example. Do you enjoy working as a software engineer? So you can imagine how this kind of question would, maybe get a response like, yeah, I enjoy it. But that's not really giving us the kind of qualitative feedback that we want, the really rich answers. So a better way to ask this might be, what do you enjoy about working as a software engineer? And what aspects of your work do you not enjoy so much? And you can see here how this would encourage the participant more to expand on what they mean, to really get into the answer and to kind of open up a little bit to you. I have two more examples here, but I'm going to skip over them for now, just so that we have enough time at the end for questions. But one thing I do want to say is that you can use closed-ended questions during an interview if you need to confirm a fact. So, you might say something like, you mentioned you studied information technology at university. Is that right? That's okay. You're just checking a fact. You're just making sure you understood the participant correctly. But in general, if you're exploring topics, you do want to ask open-ended questions where the respondent has the opportunity to really elaborate on their experience. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Sarah now in a second, but before I do, I'm just going to take a quick pause and ask everybody a favor. We at the UX Design Institute are currently working on a report that will be like a guidebook for people who want to break into a career in UX. So if anybody is on the webinar who is working as a UX designer, a UX researcher, or any other UX professional, I'd really appreciate if you would consider completing the survey. If you do complete it, you'll be in with a chance to win one of 5 €100 Amazon vouchers. And it's kind of like a pay it forward kind of thing. All of the data will be used to create this guide and to help the next generation, I guess, of aspiring UX designers to break into the industry. Okay, well, thanks everybody for your attention so far. I'm going to hand over to Sarah now. I'm just going to stop sharing and let you share, Sarah. Here we go.
All right, can everyone hear me?
Yep, all good.
Amazing. So just to get started, wanted to throw out a quick poll here. For those of you who do some work as UX researchers, how often you conduct user interviews. So that's going to be a poll that's going to come up as we get going. And while we're thinking about that, I want to talk a little bit about preparing for user interviews from a more of a logistical perspective, so a ResOps perspective. Rachel did a great job of introducing us around the things that you need to think about from a research perspective, what your questions are, what your objectives are. And now I want to talk about what are the things that you can do to prep from an operational perspective so everything runs smoothly and all you need to focus on is the interview itself. So the first thing that we need to think about is defining your target audience. And this really comes out of your research objectives. What is it that you're trying to learn? And this is important because it's going to influence all of the other things that are related to your participant recruitment, your recruitment strategy, which communities you're going to reach out to, the screening questions that you include. So having a very clear understanding of who you feel are the best people to be able to answer the questions that you have for your research project. And we'll get to talking about screening in a minute, but these can be anything from demographics. So if you have age, people from specific countries, people who use specific products, anything like that, having a very, very specific idea of this is the perfect person. If they were to jump on a call with me, I would be like, yes, you're exactly who I want to talk to. Once you have that in mind, think about what you need to use, who you need to talk to, how you're going to reach them. So your recruitment strategy. Nowadays, there are a lot of different ways that you can find people. Depending on your budget and your company's capabilities, you might want to invest in working with a recruitment agency or using an all-in-one recruitment platform where there is a built-in participant pool. If you are just starting out, maybe your company or team doesn't have the budget for those kinds of things, you can find online communities like Facebook, on LinkedIn, even doing guerrilla recruitment by going to a particular store if you know that the person you want to talk to is someone who would shop at X store. There are a lot of different ways to find people that fit any kind of budget and any kind of maturity for a research team. Then, if you're doing this online, you want to create a detailed screener. And this is really going to come back to knowing who it is you want to talk to and how are you going to filter out the people who are not necessarily right for this project. So once you have an idea about these attitudes, you can start to come up with questions. So depending on how people answer, they will either get screened out and they won't be able to move forward to schedule an interview, or they will match all of the characteristics and they'll be able to schedule an interview. And this can be as detailed or as broad as you need it to be, depending on who it is that you're trying to reach. If you're looking for general population, then you might not even need a screener at all. If you're willing to talk to anyone because you're working for a company or you're discussing a product or service that applies to every single person in the world, chances are your target audience is probably a bit more specific. If you're looking for a very niche audience, which is something that I often have to do in my own work, I'm looking for B2B folks who are fitting specific roles. So my screeners generally have to be pretty extensive, but this really depends on the kind of person you're trying to reach. So going back to that target audience again. Test the screener. This is so much about confidence, as Rachel mentioned, is about preparedness. And this is a great way to figure out it's good user experience, right? Like this idea of our screener's intuitive, people will know how to answer. User test your screener. Send it out to somebody who is not involved in your project and see how they respond. Are there questions that weren't clear to them? Were there responses that they thought were the responses that best matched their own attitudes or behaviors, and it turned out not to be the case? Your screener should be one of the very many things that you test before you actually send your interview out into the wild. And finally, scheduling participants. Again, there are a lot of tools that you can use to schedule participants, especially if you're doing it online. Nowadays, I highly recommend using some kind of scheduling tool to avoid manual back and forth emails. Hey, does this slot work for you? So things like Calendly, if you're using a built-in user testing platform, they almost always come with scheduling tools. Hotjar has its own user testing platform as part of its offering. So when I schedule interviews, I put in my availability and I link my calendar, and people only see the slots that are available in my calendar, which makes it super easy. I don't have to talk to them. If they need to reschedule, they can do it automatically. It makes my life so much easier. So those are the kind of operational things I suggest that you have put together before you get started for your recruitment. And when you're actually sending out that screener, you've got it down, you've got your schedule figured out, you're ready to book some participants. Here are some general tips and tricks that I have. First, over recruit. It is a lot easier to say, I have too many people that fit this this interview project, and I feel like I have a really good handle on it, and I'm starting to get information saturation for my interviews, and I probably don't need to conduct anymore. It's a lot easier to cancel with folks and say, hey, we've reached our participation. Thanks for joining. Please sign up for another interview in the future. Than deciding that you're short or realizing that you're short on interviews and then scrambling to recruit more people and potentially delaying the timeline for being able to get the results that you need. So depending on how hard it is to find these folks, if you have a very niche population, definitely over recruit. And if you have a much more general population and it's easier, you probably don't need to recruit as many, but there will always be no-shows. There will always be last-minute cancellations. And what will often happen, and this is something that people don't always think about until they've experienced it for the first time, is you get someone scheduled, they show up to the call, and you're talking to them, and they somehow slip through that screener, and they're not the person that you want to be talking to. And so you have to end the interview, and that's a total wash. So this is why I always tell people to have a buffer of some extra folks on deck to make sure that you have all of the people that you need to get the insights that you're looking for. I mentioned before using scheduling tools. Now, it's 2024 on Beyonce's internet. We do not need to be emailing people back and forth on 100 email threads. Calendly and other tools have free options where you can set up your calendar and link it, so you don't need to do that. But again, make it easy on yourself so you can use your brain power on the interview itself. Incentives. So this is a hot topic for folks. Depending on where you are, if you work at a huge company with a really large budget, incentives are kind of a no-brainer. You just give everyone money to participate in your work. It makes recruitment fast. People always want to sign up because you're giving them money. If you do not have the luxury of doing that, this is not a reason to not do user interviews. I think once we are in a place where we can talk to people about budget, you talk to your director, you talk to the head of product and say, look, I think we can recruit people faster. I think we can get better quality of participants if we can provide some incentive. But that's not always the case. If you don't have incentive or you have a very limited budget, raffles are a great way to get around this. So instead of giving every single participant an incentive for participating in your research, you can say, participate and you'll be entered to win X amount of money. This is a good way to incentivize people so they have a chance of getting something, but you're not paying out $50, $75, $100 to every person you do a user interview with. Also, a lot of times people are more likely to join if they feel like they're getting something out of it, right? So if the topic is interesting, if they feel like they're making an impact on your product, if in your email copy you can say, your feedback is going to influence the product roadmap, your feedback is going to influence our pricing, make them feel like their time is going to be worth something. And Leanne posted, people are happy to participate if you're clear about how their time and thoughts are going to make a difference. Absolutely. So consider that when you're writing the email copy, when you're reaching out to these folks. Be mindful of time zones. So I mean this from a participation, like from a scheduling perspective, in that like you want to make sure that the tool that you're using accounts for time zones. But more than that, I want you to think about your working hours. So I'm in Europe right now. It's 6:45 in the evening, and my normal working hours are around 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. But let's say that I want to talk to people who are based on the West Coast in the United States. It's 9:45 in the morning over there. And if I am working within the confines of my own working hours and I'm sending out a recruitment, I'm like, I'm not getting any signups. What's going on? That is one of the first culprits that I often check with folks when they're not getting signups in the way that they expect. So be mindful if you're working online with people around the world. What is the best time of day for them? It may be that during the workday, they can't talk to you because they're working. So evening time after work hours or before our work hours would be best for them. Play around with who your audience is and figuring out what time of day is likely to set you up for success in terms of what time you're willing to talk to them. And that requires a bit of flexibility on your part too. So maybe you tell your manager, hey, I need to do user interviews next week. It's with this population, which means I have to work late. So I'm going to start my day at noon and work until 8 p.m. As Leanne mentioned, clear about how their time and thoughts are going to make a difference. Not only that, but what to expect for when they show up. So, I know for a lot of people, going online to talk to somebody for an hour or half an hour that they've never met is a nerve-wracking thing. It's true also for the participant, right? They've signed up to do this and they want to help you out, but if you don't give them any idea about what they're getting themselves into, it's a nerve-wracking process for them as well. So do as much as you can in your email, not necessarily priming them, so they start to, like if they have answers for specific questions before the call, but give them an idea of, this is going to be an informal chat, or this is going to be a task-based session. This is going to last. The most important thing is how long it's going to last, because the worst thing you could do is say, expect it to be an hour, and then half an hour in, your participant's like, okay, gotta go, bye. So setting those kinds of expectations around what the session is going to be can really do a lot for building rapport with the person before you've even met them. And again, going back to those of you who currently do user research, how are you currently recruiting people? What are your biggest challenges in recruitment for interviews that you want to conduct with your users? As we're posting in the chat about that, I want to go ahead and talk about interview moderation itself. This is what it seems like a lot of people get nervous about. Rachel touched on, feeling stiff, feeling like they really need to stick to the script because they don't want to be biased in potential questions. We're going to tackle some of that now. So you've done all of this prep work. You defined your research questions and your objectives. You created and you tested your screener, you launched your recruitment, you have people signed up, and today is the day where you're finally going to sit in front of some folks and talk to them. Before you do, pilot test your interview. I said test your screener, same thing with your interview. One of the things that people mentioned is they were worried about unknown topics. They were worried about going over time. They were worried about not knowing the answers to questions that users might have. A pilot test is a great way to work out the kinks. People who, actors in a play, they do a dress rehearsal before the production. This is exactly the same thing. Schedule a pilot test, either, depending on how comfortable you feel, at least several hours, if not the day before your next set of interviews. So you have time to tweak the discussion guide if there are any changes that you want to make, if there are questions you need to take out, if you find that you have a lot of extra time and maybe your stakeholders have some additional questions they want to include. Being able to do those kinds of things makes a really big difference in feeling confident going to your interviews, because you've worked out a lot of things, you kind of know what to expect. Consent and privacy. So this depends a lot on where you work. If you work at a huge company, there is a good chance that they probably have some more formal procedures around consent. Even your participants might be required to sign an NDA form around intellectual property before the test can get started. If you're working at a really, at a startup where these formal processes around consent and privacy are not necessarily in place, it's still important to get consent from your participant. And this is especially true if you're going to be recording them. And a lot of people ask me, are people going to freak out if I want to record the session? Most of the participants I talk to have absolutely no issue with being recorded, as long as they know what the recording is going to be used for and they know that their privacy is going to be maintained. So if you're based in Europe, GDPR, data privacy is super important. Being really clear about what you're going to do with this person's data and why, and make sure that that is clear before the interview gets started. This goes a long way as well into building trust, which is a huge part of the rapport in an interview. So building rapport, I said this, it starts even before you meet the person, right? Setting expectations in the email copy about what they're getting themselves into, asking their permission and getting their consent before the interview starts. I know it can be hard, especially online where you don't have super detailed bodily cues, and it may be difficult to start to feel comfortable with somebody, but asking about their day, some icebreakers. If you're talking to them on a Monday, ask them how their weekend was. If you're talking to them on a Friday, ask them if they have plans for the weekend. One of the things I really like to do is find something that I might have in common with the person based on what I know about them. So for example, I'm based in Italy, but I'm from the US. If I see somebody who is from my hometown, I say, oh, hey, I'm from the same city. something that allows you to establish some kind of common ground to kind of break the ice and remind them that even though you're talking to them in a more formal capacity, it doesn't have to be rigid and uptight. So the more easily you can make them feel comfortable and make it seem as if it's a conversation and they can be honest with you, the more likely it is that you're going to have a successful call with somebody. Active listening. So this is something that's really important because so many people think that they are doing it and they are not. So one of the things that people mistake for active listening are preparing what they're going to respond while somebody is still talking. Active listening is listening to what the person is saying. I know that can be hard because you've got a list of questions. You're like, okay, I got to get a test set up. I have to know what question I'm going to ask afterwards. Really pay attention to what the person is saying and make them feel like you're listening to them, right? So nodding, engagement, your body language, even through a screen, makes a big difference. If somebody's doing a usability test, try to keep your face as neutral as possible. If someone clicks on something that they shouldn't have clicked on or you weren't expecting them to click on, don't go like this, because all of those little cues make a difference in terms of creating a space where people feel comfortable to give you their honest feedback. And leading into that, someone said they hated the awkward silence. Rachel talked about the awkward silence. Embrace the awkward silence. There's a reason this happens. So if someone asks you a question, you have to first listen to the question. Your brain has to process what the question was. You have to formulate a response, and then you have to give the response. This takes some time, right? And it takes even more time. And this is something that I always tell folks, if you are working with people whose native language is not the language that you're conducting the interview in, that might require them to collect their thoughts, and it might take a little bit longer than if you're speaking to somebody with whom this is their mother tongue. So embrace the silence and resist the urge to follow up. So either rephrase the question or to follow up with some examples of how they can respond. This is what I always see with people who are uncomfortable with awkward silences. They ask the question, and if the person doesn't respond immediately, they'll give some examples of how they could respond, or they'll rephrase the question or ask follow-up questions. So this is bad for two reasons. One, it can be overwhelming. If you ask somebody a question and then you follow it up with three more similar questions, they start to get extremely overwhelmed and often can't figure out what it is that they really need to be answering. The other reason is that it introduces bias. This is especially true when people start to give examples. So they say, how do you feel about this? Right? And instead of just stopping there and waiting, they say, do you think it's this? Do you like this? And you're already introducing bias. You're telling them what you want to hear. Embrace the awkward silence. This comes with practice. It's really uncomfortable at first. If the person really doesn't understand the question, they'll often tell you. They'll say, I'm sorry, what did you mean by that? Or can you phrase it in a different way? So the only thing I can say is that a lot can stand to be gained if you're willing to sit with the discomfort. And all of this contributes into what I call a judgment-free zone. The more you are able to make somebody feel comfortable that whatever they say is okay, that is really where the juice comes, where people start to open up, they start to share things. And, depending on the topic, it might be even something as mundane as like, how do they use the internet? But make them feel like there's not only that there's no right or wrong answer, but what they're saying is interesting, because it is, right? That's why we get into UX research, because we find people interesting and the way they live their lives and do certain things to be interesting. So make them feel like they matter. That's the number one way to build rapport with people. And the last thing I'll say, I really want to make sure we have time for questions, is to recruit a note taker. It's a lot of work to focus on what somebody's saying, to be an active listener, to figure out which questions you want to follow up with that may be off script. The last thing you want to worry about is having to take notes on top of it all. So if you are using like an all-in-one platform, when I use Hotjar, the interview tool on Hotjar, I'm able to take notes, and there's a timestamp, so I can even put one word and it'll timestamp for me, and then I can go back and rewatch that. But I also recommend, if you can, to recruit somebody to be a note taker for you. This is great for a couple of reasons. One, it allows you to actually focus on the conversation that you're having. And two, it also encourages your stakeholders to get involved with interviews. And sometimes stakeholders will join an interview, but they've got like their Slack open, they've got a couple windows open, they're doing other tasks, they're not really paying attention to what's going on. This is a great way for them to really listen to what the person is saying. So if you can't get a note taker, being able to like timestamp even like, oh, minute 17, go back and rewatch this. And then you don't have to like really focus anymore. But it's even better if you can get someone on your team to join those calls and take notes with you. Rich said AI note takers work too. Yes, this is a very fast-paced field nowadays. You know, Zoom has transcripts. Everyone, there's like AI note taking, so a note taker may be obsolete very soon. But in the meantime, I encourage it, if not for the technical reasons, for the rapport building with your stakeholders and getting them involved and building empathy with them for their users. So that's all I have to say around that. You heard me mention Engage a couple of times. That's the platform that I use working at Hotjar. We have participant pools, and I use it for everything from recruitment to the screener questions that I talked to you about, to the scheduling, to bringing people on my team. You can see here on this screen, there's notes and then there's a timestamp. I love that. It's my favorite. And then you can even clip, download, share bits of interviews that you thought were really interesting. So we have a free trial going. The details of that are going to be sent out after the webinar. So you don't have to worry about taking all of this in right now. We have a few minutes left, and I want to make sure we address at least a couple of questions.
Cool. Thanks so much for that, Sarah. So I was answering some questions on the fly there just towards the end, just typing some answers, but we do have 3 kind of top questions here that I think we should answer for whoever has a couple of minutes to stick around. We have one question about strategic UX research, which I might get you to answer in a second, Sarah. But I'm going to address the first one, which is how many participants do you need to recruit for a reliable result? I'd love your input on this in a second, Sarah, but I'll kick off with this one and give you a breather for a second. So this is kind of like not the answer you're going to want to hear, but it's also like the truth is, how long is a piece of string? It really depends on the research. So I'll give you some context. It really depends on the level of risk involved in the research you're doing. You know, if you're making a really small change to your website, your app, your product, and you don't feel like there's going to be all that much risk involved, you could probably get away with doing, a smaller number of user interviews. Maybe 3 or 4 user interviews might be okay. But you also want to make sure that towards the end, like your last user interview, there aren't lots of new topics coming up, because if there are, that means you haven't reached what we call saturation, which is where everything that's going to be explored has been explored and you feel comfortable that you've heard everything you need to hear. If you're doing a study where there's a lot of risk involved, qualitative research may not be the answer. You may want to look at a quantitative study where you can have a couple of 100 respondents. But if you are going for qualitative, you may want to look at doing almost, you could do 10 or 12 interviews. There's no real hard and fast rule. There's some resources that will say you only ever need to do 6 or only ever need to do 8. But really my recommendation would be, it depends on the level of risk, it depends on the nature of the research, and it depends on when you're doing the interviews, are lots of new topics coming up? You've done 4 interviews, but you're hearing lots of new things. You may want to get recruiting again, ask a few more people, because it can happen that a topic you think is going to be quite straightforward actually ends up being a little bit more complex. Things are uncovered that you didn't realize. But as a general rule, I wouldn't recommend any less than 3 or 4 user interviews at least. Any more than 10 to 12, and really you should probably be looking at doing a quantitative study. Sarah, I don't know, are you going to agree, disagree? Qualitative researchers disagree on this all the time.
Yeah, my general rule around qualitative research is stop when you start to feel like you're getting the same thing over and over again. And that can be, I don't want to give a hard number, because if you're talking to different customer segments, it might mean that you need, a certain number of people from each segment. And so the total number is more than that. But once you start to feel like you're not really surprised by what people are saying, that's a general indication. And that's the saturation that Rachel is talking about, that you've probably learned everything there is to know about that particular question.
Yeah. Cool. I'm glad we didn't end up getting into a big debate. Okay, so strategic research then. Lorcan has a question. Strategic UX research is the next big thing. Can I get your thoughts on this? Do you want to start us off with that one, Sarah?
Yeah, so this is a really big topic right now. And I'll say this also for those of you, it sounds like a lot of you are doing a career pivot into UX research. It's a rough time to be in UX research. I'm going to be completely honest with you. The job market, the landscape looks very different than when I was first looking for a UX research job. And I don't mean that to like say, give up, don't do it, but it is important to be realistic. And this kind of triggered a crisis, especially with the layoffs from big companies recently of like, what is UX research for? Is it valuable? Is it not valuable? And for those of you who are on LinkedIn, I highly recommend you go to Judd Anton's LinkedIn profile. Judd Anton is a very well-known user researcher. He's built tons of UX research teams across Airbnb and a lot of other big companies. And he recently did a very interesting guest appearance on Lenny's podcast, where he talks about this exact thing. And he describes 3 levels of research, which is like strategic, high level, future thinking research, and then the kind of micro UX, UI, usability research, and then what he calls middle research. And he has a really interesting conversation about how middle research could be kind of the dead zone, and how to get out of the dead zone where you're talking about either strategic research or micro UI research. And I thought it was really interesting and highly recommend that you listen to that podcast. But all this to say is I think strategic research is really an interesting future for UX researchers, because we are when it allows us to think about things that are much more related to user needs in a future casting way. So that's really where the innovation comes up, is identifying needs and problems that haven't been addressed in the market yet, and pivoting to how we can leverage those opportunities within our own product space. So I do think that that's a really important topic. Definitely go check out that podcast. But yeah, I definitely agree. I personally prefer strategic research to like kind of the middle ground research where it's interesting, but then people aren't really sure how to apply it, what to do with it. Yeah, feel free to follow up with me on LinkedIn. It's a really big topic for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you touched, Sarah, on what the final question really that's come through, because a lot of the questions we've had this evening have been on these kind of themes, these top themes. And the final one is just about breaking into the industry, and there being a perceived lack of jobs out there, and jobs looking for 1 to 2 years experience, even for juniors. So I think if we give our advice on that to finish up the webinar, that might be helpful. I'll just start off by saying, like, having been in the position of both applying for research jobs and being the person hiring researchers, always apply even if you don't have the minimum experience level. As long as you can demonstrate how other job experience you've had relates to this role. My recommendation would be take the time to adjust your CV to make it relevant to the job you're applying for. The number of CVs I get where the job title hasn't been changed to the job, or they're not calling out the specific experience that they have for this particular job, those are the CVs that stand out and will catch attention. But don't be put off by 1 to 2 years experience. You just show how, what you've done in your past career, how that can make up for the fact that you don't have that specific research experience. And the last thing I would say is use your CV and your cover letter, if you include one, as a way of showing the skills that you'll need as a researcher. So you're going to need to be a good storyteller. The first story you're going to tell is your story of your career, and you can do that with your CV and your covering letter. So make sure that you're presenting yourself the best way you can, and really showing the skills that you have.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll add about this is, it's going to sound so cliche, but it's really true, is network. So many of the jobs that I've seen, especially around UX research these days, have been a post of somebody that I follow, as opposed to like a job that LinkedIn recommended. So if you are interested in UX research, start following some of the people at companies that you think would be really interesting to work at. So if they post that they're hiring, you'll see it often before any of the job websites or even LinkedIn jobs will have it. And you'll also know who the hiring manager is. So you can do some like background stalking around who that person is and how to create a relationship with them as you're drafting your cover letter, right? So follow the spaces that you want to be a part of, and comment. As I said before, like I try to repost as many job listings that come up on my LinkedIn, so folks who follow me see those. And as painful as it can be to talk to complete strangers, informational interviews can be a really good way of understanding what it's like to work at different jobs. Because I think one of the things that people often lose sight of is a job search is a two-way process, right? Like obviously you want a job, but you want to be at a place that works for you. And in order to do that, you need to understand the kind of spaces that where you think you would work well or where you perhaps would not work as well. Because working at a 50-person startup versus working at a 10,000 plus huge enterprise company are completely different experiences. So talking to people who work in those environments to get a sense of what their work life is like, I think is really important, because it helps you have a laser focus on the right role for you. So when it pops up, you're able to craft that story as Rachel described before.
Yeah, 100%. And as Sarah mentioned, feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn. I think we're both busy kind of reposting any research jobs that we see at the moment. So, you know, LinkedIn is a great place to see those posts, and even to join groups and things that are posting about jobs. Okay, I think that's all we have time for. I think hopefully between written answers to your questions and the answers we've given there, that we've hopefully answered as many questions as we can. I'll have another check through the questions panel and make sure that we type a few responses if there's anything missing. So feel free to hang around and get a typed answer to your question. But thank you all so much for your engagement in the webinar, for taking part in the polls and giving us your input. It's just made it really enjoyable for us, and hopefully you've learned something here today as well.
And please reach out to either of us on LinkedIn if you have an urgent question that we didn't get a chance to answer. Really happy to answer questions offline as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, thanks everybody.
Thanks so much, all. Take care.